Good afternoon. I am Kendra Jensen. Today I will be briefing my estimative intelligence assessment on Moldova's future through 2030. Specifically, this briefing examines Moldova's prospects for EU accession while facing sustained Russian pressure aimed at keeping the country within Moscow's sphere of influence. So this briefing will cover four main areas. First, I will outline the analytical tradecraft that was used, including confidence, sourcing, and various gaps. Second, I will discuss Moldova's current state of affairs and the key challenges it faces. Third, I'll walk through the structured analytic technique and the driving factors shaping Moldova's trajectory and how those were applied. Finally, I'll present the integrated assessment and alternative outcomes. So I will start with the analytic tradecraft that was used during this assessment with some of the challenges. So this assessment is held with moderate confidence. That confidence is based on a robust body of open source reporting and is consistent with the trends in Moldova's reform efforts, Western support, and Russian tactics, techniques, and procedures. There are no linchpin assumptions that would completely collapse the assessment if proven false, but any significant deviations would call for a reassessment. So with sourcing, it is primarily curated again on open source information, while individual reports are indirect and of unknown reliability. They become more reliable when assessed in aggregate. Primary sources were the EU Commission on Moldova's progress through its accession negotiations, US assessments of Moldova's capacity, and some native Russian texts that I translated myself. The main key intelligence gap was the limited visibility into Russian operational planning and Moldova's internal intelligence capabilities. One of the key assumptions is that Russia will continue to employ their hybrid warfare techniques consistent with past behavior in Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia. Even if this assumption were incorrect, it would not fundamentally alter the judgment regarding Russian intent to exert influence, as Moscow has repeatedly confirmed their perceived privilege in this sphere of influence. So I will now turn to Moldova's current situation. So since 2022, Moldova has pursued a clear Euro-Atlantic course. They've been applying for EU membership and launching accession negotiations. Despite this progress, Moldova faces fairly significant challenges. These include the political and economic instability, high poverty rates, entrenched corruption, and lingering dependence on Russian energy. So unresolved territorial conflicts in Transnistria and Gagauzia continue to constrain Moldova's security environment, and at the same time, Russian hybrid threat activity has increased. So that has particularly been targeting elections, the information space, energy infrastructure. These pressures are all compounded by the influx of Ukrainian refugees and an ongoing agricultural crisis in Moldova. So to analyze how these pressures are interacting, the assessment used a structured analytic technique of multiple scenarios generation for clarity and fidelity, and I will go over that now. So this assessment employs the multiple scenarios generation structured analytic technique. This multiple scenarios generation is designed to compare complex and uncertain environments by examining how key drivers interact across a spectrum of conditions, rather than predicting a single future and then providing that to decision makers. This method explores multiple plausible trajectories and includes a series of matrices within which they interact. So the 6 driving factors that were assessed and paired in these synthesis matrices are here. There are status of Moldovan internal governance structures. I'll go through those in detail, but these scenarios were then integrated these driving factors were paired into the synthesis matrices to generate scenarios. And then these scenarios were then integrated to identify the most likely trajectory while retaining some credible alternative options and trajectories. So I'll now go through the key driving factors and how they were integrated. So Moldova's internal governance structures are a critical driver because there is a fluctuation in success. So judicial reform has advanced through extensive vetting processes launched in early 2025. Those were aimed at improving transparency and integrity. Anti-corruption efforts have also strengthened. There's been an increase in prosecutions of high-ranking officials. But despite progress, reforms remain slow and face significant political resistance. And the public administration, the way it is structured, also holds capacity restraints still. So governance resilience directly affects public trust and Moldova's ability to integrate the necessary reforms and meet EU accession criteria. So there is growth, but there is still plenty of room to grow. So a second major driver is the intensity of Russian aggression. So Russia continues to employ a wide spectrum of hybrid warfare tools against Moldova. These include disinformation campaigns, cyber operations, illicit political financing, and energy coercion. The Kremlin considers Moldova within its sphere of influence and uses political, economic, informational, and infrastructural leverage likely to sabotage EU integration. For example, there has been a series of escalating interference attempts. So since 2022, in 2022 specifically, Russia engineered an energy crisis where there was a series of missile strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure that Moldova relies on, and simultaneous Gazprom cuts that were aimed to induce blackouts, incite protests. And then they were able to come out of that with the assistance of EU and Romania. Then in 2023, there was a coup attempt with likely Wagner operatives and Serbian football fans that were sent in to incite, again, protests and unrest. And then in 2024 and 2025, there have been significant aggressive attempts to corrupt the presidential and parliamentary elections. There was approximately $139 million funded for illicit financing, crypto laundering, and disinformation campaigns during that period. So while Russia currently avoids overt military escalation, and it is resource constrained because of the conflict in Ukraine, it retains significant coercive leverage in Moldova. So the intensity of Russian aggression is closely tied to broader regional dynamics, particularly those developments in Ukraine and those Western responses and how the West responds to these aggressive tactics and escalatory activities. So these two factors are assessed together in the first synthesis matrix, which I'll show. So this is the first example of how the multiple scenarios generation structured analytic technique was used to analyze the relationship between two critical driving factors. So this matrix examines the interaction between Moldovan governance, resilience, and Russian aggression intensity. The scenarios that are then produced, they highlight everything from democratic regression under the high aggression and weak governance to accelerated reform when governance is strong and aggression is constrained. So this matrix highlights how institutional strength can blunt and combat Russian coercive efforts. So next I'll address the following two driving factors about energy and economic independence and Western economic aid. So Moldova has made notable progress in reducing dependence on Russian gas, particularly through partnerships with Romania and Ukraine and alignment with EU energy reforms. However, diversification is still incomplete and continues to be a heavy cost for Moldova. Economically, Moldova has increased trade with the EU, which accounted for roughly 2/3 of their exports in 2024. So despite this, the economy remains vulnerable to external shocks, climate impacts, which they're seeing in the last couple of years with their agricultural crisis, and continued fiscal deficits. So the next driving factor focuses on how Western support plays a decisive role alongside these specific developments. So the EU and the United States are the largest providers of financial assistance to Moldova, within the EU committing nearly 1.9 billion euros through 2027. So this aid supports reform implementation, energy diversification, and economic stability. Security cooperation has been critical. Allied intelligence sharing helped expose and disrupt the Russian-backed coup in 2023, and then also assisted Moldova come through the 2022 energy crisis. So military assistance through the European Peace Facility has improved the capacity for Moldova, although the Moldovan armed forces remain heavily under-equipped. And this issue is exacerbated by Moldova's constitutional military neutrality. So these factors are synthesized in the next matrix. So this matrix assesses Moldova's energy independence alongside Western support. Outcomes here range from crisis and instability when both are weak to broader geopolitical growth when energy diversification is strengthened and there is sustained aid when those reinforce one another. That is when we can see the broader geopolitical growth. So the final set of drivers focuses on informational and territorial challenges. So Moldova remains vulnerable to foreign information manipulation and interference, or FIMI. Russian disinformation campaigns persist, particularly in high poverty regions. Operations such as Matryoshka and Overload specifically target the public trust and electoral integrity, as we've seen in the past. Legal reforms have improved oversight over these issues, but the online space remains largely underregulated, and media ownership is still very concentrated, which limits resilience for Moldova. So closely related to this is Russian exploitation of territorial and political conflicts. So Russia continues to exploit the unresolved territorial conflicts, specifically in Transnistria, and where Russia maintains approximately 1,500 troops and leverages energy dependence through there. These frozen conflicts, another one is in Gagauzia, which is has a significant pro-Russian sentiment. That sentiment remains strong and politically exploitable. These conflicts constrain Moldova's security options and divert significant resources from growth to security. They also provide Russia with escalation pathways to stay in that gray zone in their hybrid warfare tactics and maintain varying levels of plausible deniability. So these dynamics are captured in the third synthesis matrix. So this matrix evaluates how information resilience interacts with territorial exploitation and that conflict exploitation. So outcomes range from gradual erosion of state legitimacy to full crisis mitigation, where Moldovan authorities are supported by Western intelligence agencies and are able to broadcast those FIMI attacks and really truly combat it and progress. So I'll turn now to the integrated assessment. So by combining the driving factors into these matrices through the multiple scenarios generation structured analytic technique, and then analyzing the details of Moldova's progress, external factors, Russian capacity and intent, the assessment pointed towards Moldova's trajectory by 2030 as resource constrained, but with continual progression towards Western integration. So under this scenario, Moldova continues moving toward the EU and EU accession with strong support from Western nations in the Euro-Atlantic community, but will remain under constant pressure from Russian hybrid interference. So reforms are likely to advance slowly and unevenly, but Russia will likely not be able to limit Moldova's sovereignty and pro-Western orientation on the whole. So some key signposts to watch include continued anti-corruption and judicial reforms, expanded intelligence sharing with Western partners, stronger resilience to disinformation, sustained Western financial and security assistance. While conflicts in Transnistria and Gagauzia are likely to remain unresolved in this specific scenario due to that high Russian pressure, they are expected to stay manageable if these expectations are met. There are, however, of course, alternative trajectories. An optimistic trajectory would involve accelerated reforms, near total energy independence, strong economic growth, and accelerated EU accession. This would likely require Russian resources to be highly constrained or directed elsewhere if there was another conflict to erupt. A more pessimistic trajectory would involve halted or stalled reforms entirely, reduced Western assistance, intensified Russian exploitation of those conflicts and internal vulnerabilities. This could potentially halt EU accession and reverse security cooperation. So that concludes my briefing. Thank you very much for your attention. Please feel free to reach out with any questions. Thank you.